When people talk about automotive relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, the assumption is usually that the cooperation was one-sided. Americans sold cars, technologies, and licenses to the USSR, and at times the Soviets simply copied American designs. And of course, there was Lend-Lease. But there was another side to this story, the export of Soviet cars to the United States. And its most intriguing and dramatic chapter involved Moskvich, when a Soviet car suddenly found itself at the very center of a spy scandal, despite having nothing to do with it. But let's take it step by step. When exactly the first Soviet cars appeared in the United States is known quite precisely. It happened in late 1933. And no, they were not Moskviches. Two vehicles from the Gorky automobile plant crossed the Atlantic, the Gaz A Phaeton and the Gaz AA truck, essentially licensed versions of the Ford Model A and Model AA. They arrived at Ford Motor Company not as exports, but for technical study, under an existing contract. So the Soviet auto industry's first appearance in the United States turned out to be a technical episode, not an attempt to enter the market. A similar situation followed a few years later. In the late 1930s, a Soviet embassy garage in the U.S. received a ZIS 101 luxury limousine. The American press noticed it, but once again, this was a demonstration, not a commercial effort. Later, in 1954, another Soviet limousine, the ZIS 110, received a rather blunt assessment from Henry Ford II. Frankly, he said, "We were building cars like this about 20 years ago." That remark made the newspapers, and tellingly, the Soviet side did not dispute it. In the official post-exhibition report, the exhibition director Konstantin Pavlov wrote, "Displaying outdated models brings nothing but harm." The first Soviet cars to be genuinely exported abroad were Moskviches. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Moskvich cars were being exported to 36 countries, including Scandinavia, Finland, and Belgium. As early as 1957, the Moskvich 402 ended up in the hands of British journalists. The Soviet car had been brought to the United Kingdom by a Norwegian sailor visiting an acquaintance. The vehicle attracted attention, and reporters decided to take a closer look. Their assessment was fairly objective. Journalists described the car as simple and easy to drive, with good grip, well-designed synchronizers, decent lighting, and precise steering. The suspension, they noted, provided a comfortable ride on poor roads. At the same time, they directly stated that in terms of interior finish and performance, the car was unacceptable for the average British buyer. And indeed, performance was the Moskvich 402's weakest point. The car was powered by a modest 35 horsepower engine, allowing a top speed of only 105 kilometers per hour. Acceleration from standstill to 100 kilometers per hour was neither measured nor officially stated by the manufacturer. Given that, the conclusions of the British press were entirely logical. The Soviet side understood this perfectly well. That is why the Moskvich 402 was rarely exported. It simply could not compete with Western equivalents. The situation changed with the updated model known as the Moskvich 407. This version was better suited for foreign markets and became the primary export model. The key changes were under the hood. The new overhead valve engine produced 50 horsepower, and top speed increased to 115 kilometers per hour. Acceleration figures were still not officially published, apparently because this parameter was not considered particularly important at the time. Nevertheless, the Moskvich 407 enjoyed some success abroad. In Belgium, for example, the company's Scaldia Volga not only sold Moskvich cars, sometimes with its own trim and detailing, but also received knockdown kits from Moscow to install 1.6-liter Perkins diesel engines rated at 43 horsepower. There are two main versions of how Moskvich ended up in the United States. Which one is accurate is difficult to say, so it makes sense to mention both and let the viewer decide. According to the first version, the story began in 1959, during a meeting between Nikita Khrushchev and Dwight Eisenhower. During an informal conversation, Eisenhower reportedly remarked that it might be a good idea to sell Soviet cars in the United States. After that, the Moskvich plant, officially known as the Moscow Small Car Plant, was instructed to prepare a batch of Moskvich 407 cars for the American market. The second version tells a different story. At the London Motor Show in 1958, Robert Joseph Castle, a businessman from the small city of Syracuse, New York, saw the Moskvich 407 for the first time and took notice. From a business perspective, he saw commercial potential and decided to try selling the car in the United States. In February 1960, the two sides signed the first Soviet-American trade agreement for the supply of passenger cars and spare parts to the United States. Under the terms of the two-year contract, 10,000 Moskvich cars were expected to be imported. What was the young American actually counting on when he decided to sell Moskvich cars in the United States? The American automotive market of the early 1960s was the complete opposite of the Soviet one. Large land yachts with velour sofas, air conditioning, and a high level of comfort. Even European cars looked pale against that background, let alone a Soviet Moskvich. At the same time, the compact car segment in the US remained largely undeveloped. That was the niche Robert Castle hoped to enter. Although, by American standards, the Moskvich was not really compact but closer to a microcar. For comparison, the Rambler American, which performed reasonably well on the market, was considered compact in the US, while by European standards, it already belonged to the mid-size class. Each year, around 700,000 imported passenger cars were sold in the United States, and a volume of 10,000 Moskvich cars did not look unrealistic. All that remained was to offer a competitive price, especially since price had often been the key factor behind the success of Soviet cars in foreign markets. This is where the problems began. Soviet cars were subject to a 10% import duty, compared to 8.5% for vehicles from other countries. Import duties on spare parts were even higher, 25% versus 10.5%. Add to that complex logistics. As a result, the price of a Moskvich in the United States reached roughly $1,800. That was not cheap. A 1960 Rambler American started at $1,795, was better equipped, and belonged to an entirely different class. Still, Castle did not see this as a deal breaker. He expected to find buyers, including those interested in unusual and unconventional vehicles. The first shipment, around 100 Moskvich cars, had already arrived in the United States. Another 500 were on the way. And then came May 1st, 1960. Early that morning, an American Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft took off from a U.S. airbase in Pakistan. The pilot was Francis Powers. The final destination of the flight was supposed to be Norway, but the route passed directly over the territory of the Soviet Union. The purpose of the flight was the photographic reconnaissance of Soviet military and nuclear facilities. The U-2 operated at altitudes of 20 to 21 kilometers, which in the mid-1950s were considered unreachable for Soviet air defense systems. That assumption turned out to be a fatal mistake. The aircraft crossed the Soviet state border at 5:36 local time. At 8:53, near Sverdlovsk, the U-2 was shot down by a missile from the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile system. The strike hit the tail section of the aircraft, while the cockpit remained largely intact. Powers was able to leave the aircraft and descend by parachute, surviving the incident. After landing, he was detained by local residents near the wreckage. According to official reports, he was carrying a silenced pistol, a hunting knife, an inflatable life raft, supplies of food and water, signal flares, a compass, Soviet rubles, gold rings, and several gold watches, a hollow $1 coin with a poisoned needle, an explosive device, and a silk banner bearing a message in 14 languages. I bear no ill will toward your people. If you help me, you will be rewarded. Whether this inventory fully reflected reality or was partly shaped by Soviet investigators is still a matter of debate. Powers was taken to Moscow, where he was interrogated and placed in custody. On May 3rd, the U.S. government announced that the U-2 had been operating as part of a program to study meteorological conditions in the upper atmosphere, and that one such aircraft had gone missing on May 1st after the pilot reported oxygen system problems while flying over Turkey. However, the downed aircraft had survived the fall surprisingly well, including much of its internal equipment, which the Soviet side was able to present publicly. The consequences of the incident were disappointing. In May 1960, the Paris summit was scheduled to take place with the participation of Eisenhower, Khrushchev, and the leaders of the United Kingdom and France. The agenda included nuclear disarmament talks, limits on weapons testing, and a general easing of tensions. Khrushchev demanded that Eisenhower issue a public apology and guarantee that such flights would cease. Eisenhower acknowledged the espionage flights, but refused to apologize. The summit collapsed, and instead of détente, a new phase of confrontation began. Francis Powers was sentenced to 10 years in prison for espionage. Under these circumstances, selling Moskvich cars in the United States became practically impossible. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce declared that Soviet automobiles would not be allowed onto the American market. At the same time, about 100 Moskvich cars were already in the United States, while a vessel carrying around 500 more vehicles bound for American shores was turned back. The Moskviches will just sit there until Khrushchev lets Powers go home in one of them, Robert Castle remarked. The American press soon labeled Castle a victim of the Cold War. It also became clear that the glass, bumpers, and lighting equipment of the Moskvich cars did not meet U.S. safety regulations. Only 3 sold vehicles are documented with certainty. The rest were most likely returned to the Soviet Union or redirected to Europe, where they were sold through local dealers. At least one of those cars, however, became known in certain circles, the so-called Texas Moskvich. In the late 1960s, a strange, partially disassembled car of unknown origin ended up at an American scrapyard. Before sending it to the crusher, the scrapyard owner, Bev Kidwell, out of sheer curiosity, decided to put the car back together and take it for a drive. For some reason, the car caught his interest and it never went under the press. Through an acquaintance at the Department of Motor Vehicles, Kidwell managed to arrange paperwork and purchased the car from the state for just $35. Later, dock workers recognized the car and told Bev the story of a failed attempt to export Soviet cars to the United States. On another occasion, the Moskvich was spotted by the captain of a Soviet cargo ship, who unsuccessfully tried to buy it, but did explain what the car was actually called, as it was listed under a strange name in the documents, and also presented Bev with a set of metric tools. Bev did not have the money for a full restoration, and for nearly 20 years, the Moskvich stood in a remote corner of the scrapyard, not running, but not scrapped either. In 1982, Kidwell placed an advertisement offering the car for sale. It was noticed by Gary Bricken, a collector and specialist in Soviet automobiles, who bought the Moskvich for $300 and transported it to Texas. Restoration proved difficult. Gary had neither manuals nor diagrams nor spare parts. They could not be found in the United States, were difficult to obtain in Europe, and were almost impossible to source in the Soviet Union. At one point, he wrote an emotional letter to Leonid Brezhnev, referring to promises made by Auto Export to support owners of Soviet cars wherever they might be. After that, a shipment unexpectedly arrived containing essential spare parts, documentation, and later, a full set of new tires. Everything was provided free of charge. The purchase and restoration cost Gary approximately $4,400. He named his Moskvich Son of Moscow. From 1959 to 1963, around 127,000 Moskvich cars were exported, 42% of total production. Against this backdrop, the 10,000 vehicles planned for the American market did not make a significant difference. Still, it was a real opportunity for cooperation and a chance for the development of more normal relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. On February 10, 1962, in Berlin, on the Glienicke Bridge, Francis Gary Powers was exchanged for Soviet intelligence officer William Fisher, better known as Rudolf Abel. Thank you for watching until the end. Don't forget to leave a comment. It's the best way to support the channel. See you next time with more interesting stories.